The phone rang at 2 a.m., and Marilyn Monroe knew before she answered who it would be. Not the president this time. Those calls had stopped months ago, replaced by polite distance and the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. No, this would be Bobby, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, the president's brother, the man who'd been tasked with the impossible job of extracting Marilyn Monroe from the Kennedy family orbit. The man who'd somehow become more entangled than his brother ever was. She stared at the ringing phone in her Brentwood bedroom, her hand trembling as she reached for it. Some calls you answer even when you know they'll break your heart. It had started so differently, so innocently, if anything involving the most powerful family in America could ever be called innocent. February 1962, a dinner party at Peter Lawford's Santa Monica beach house. Peter, married to Patricia Kennedy, was the bridge between Hollywood and Camelot, and he loved playing that role. "Marilyn, you simply must meet Jack," he'd said weeks earlier, using the president's nickname with the casual intimacy of family. "You'll adore each other." What Peter hadn't mentioned was that adoring each other was exactly what the president had in mind. She'd worn white that night. She always wore white when she wanted to seem pure, unthreatening, the opposite of the bombshell everyone expected. The dress was simple, elegant, expensive. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, but underneath the Marilyn Monroe costume, Norma Jean was terrified. She was about to meet the President of the United States. The most powerful man in the world wanted to meet her. Not for a photo op, not for a public event, but privately, intimately. The implications were obvious, and she'd be lying if she said she hadn't thought about them. President Kennedy arrived late, of course, with Secret Service hovering at a discreet distance. He had that smile, the one that had won him the election, the one that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. "Miss Monroe," he said, taking her hand, his Boston accent softening the formality. "I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." And just like that, she was charmed. Just like millions of other Americans, she fell under the Kennedy spell. But here's what nobody tells you about powerful men. They don't see people. They see conquests, achievements, notches on a very prestigious belt. The affair, if you could call it that, lasted only a few months. A handful of meetings, always arranged by Peter Lawford, always in private homes or hotel suites, always with the Secret Service looking the other way. JFK was practiced at this. He'd had countless affairs, a whole apparatus designed to facilitate his extramarital activities while keeping them from the press and, more importantly, from his wife Jackie. For the president, Marilyn was a prize, a trophy, the ultimate validation of his power and charisma. For Marilyn, it was something else entirely. It was validation of a different kind, proof that she mattered, that she was special, that the most important man in the world wanted her. But the most shocking part was still coming. Because while JFK was treating her like an amusing diversion, Marilyn was doing what she always did. Falling in love, or at least falling in love with the idea of being loved. She started calling the White House, started talking to friends about a future with the president, about him leaving Jackie, about becoming First Lady. It was delusional, of course. JFK had no intention of leaving his wife, no intention of risking his presidency for an affair with a movie star. But Marilyn, damaged by a childhood of abandonment and a lifetime of being used, couldn't see the difference between sex and love, between attention and commitment. That's when Bobby Kennedy entered the picture. In March 1962, the president tasked his brother, the Attorney General, with a delicate mission: end things with Marilyn Monroe. Make her understand it was over. Keep her quiet. Keep her from becoming a problem. Bobby was the family's fixer, the tough one, the enforcer. He'd handled union bosses and mobsters and corrupt politicians. How hard could it be to handle one emotionally fragile actress? He flew to Los Angeles, arranged a meeting through Peter Lawford, and prepared to deliver the message. Stay away from the president. Stop calling the White House. This thing between you never really existed anyway. But something unexpected happened in that meeting. Bobby Kennedy, the tough Attorney General, the man who stared down Jimmy Hoffa without blinking, met Marilyn Monroe. Not the sex symbol, not the movie star, but the real woman underneath. The vulnerable, intelligent, damaged woman who quoted Dostoevsky and wanted desperately to be taken seriously. And instead of just delivering his brother's rejection and walking away, he stayed. They talked for hours about politics, about justice, about poverty and civil rights, subjects Bobby was passionate about. And Marilyn, who'd spent years being dismissed as just a pretty face, found someone who actually listened when she spoke. This is exactly where everything changed, because Bobby Kennedy did something his brother never did. He saw Marilyn as a person. He engaged with her mind, not just her body. And for a woman who'd spent her entire life being objectified, being valued only for her sexuality and her image, that was intoxicating. More intoxicating than anything JFK had offered. Bobby was different. Bobby was serious. Bobby seemed to actually care. And so, in the cruelest irony imaginable, Marilyn fell for the man who'd been sent to get rid of her. The relationship that developed between Marilyn and Bobby Kennedy over the next few months was complex, contradictory, and probably doomed from the start. Bobby was a devout Catholic, married to Ethel Kennedy with 7 children and more on the way. He genuinely loved his wife in a way his brother never seemed to love Jackie. But he was also drawn to Marilyn in a way he couldn't quite explain or resist. She challenged him intellectually, shared his passion for social justice, and represented something his buttoned-up political life didn't allow. Spontaneity, vulnerability, raw emotion. They talked on the phone constantly. Late-night conversations that lasted hours, discussing everything from Freud to farm workers' rights. Bobby sent her books, serious political tomes, philosophy, poetry. Marilyn read them all, annotated them, called him back to discuss. For the first time in years, maybe ever, she felt intellectually valued. She started telling friends that Bobby was going to leave Ethel, that they were going to be together, that this was different from Jack, that this was real. Her friends, watching this unfold, grew increasingly worried. This wasn't going to end well. The Attorney General wasn't going to leave his wife for Marilyn Monroe. The Kennedy family would never allow it. And they were right. By mid-1962, the situation had become untenable. Marilyn was becoming increasingly unstable, increasingly demanding, increasingly public about her feelings for Bobby. She showed up at Peter Lawford's house when she knew Bobby would be there. She talked about their relationship to friends who might talk to the press. She called his office at the Justice Department, leaving messages that his secretary had to intercept. And worst of all, she started to become a political liability. Rumors were spreading, J. Edgar Hoover was taking notes, and the Kennedy brothers' enemies were gathering ammunition. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, though. Because in early August 1962, Bobby Kennedy made a decision. He would fly to Los Angeles one last time. He would meet with Marilyn face to face, and he would end it definitively, completely, no matter how much it hurt either of them. It was necessary. For his family, for his career, for the president's administration. Personal feelings, no matter how real, couldn't matter more than duty. That's what Bobby told himself anyway, as he arranged what would be his final meeting with Marilyn Monroe. August 4th, 1962. The day that would end with Marilyn Monroe dead in her bedroom, an empty bottle of Nembutal nearby, questions that would never be fully answered, and conspiracy theories that would last for decades. But before all that, before the tragedy, there was that last phone call at 2 a.m. that we started with. Marilyn had answered, and Bobby's voice came through, tense and tired. "Marilyn, we need to talk. Not how are you, not I miss you. Just the blunt announcement that this conversation would be difficult. You're ending it," she said flatly. Not a question. She'd heard this tone before from other men, other times, the tone that meant she was about to be abandoned again. "It's not that simple," Bobby started, but she cut him off. "Yes, it is. It's exactly that simple. You're choosing them over me, your family, your career, your precious Kennedy reputation. I'm the inconvenient complication that needs to be eliminated. Her voice was rising, pills and alcohol mixing with heartbreak to strip away any pretense of composure. Marilyn, please understand. Understand what? That I'm good enough to call in the middle of the night, good enough to discuss philosophy with, good enough to sleep with, but not good enough to actually be with. I understand perfectly, Bobby. I've understood my whole life. I'm not good enough. I'm never good enough. The pain in her voice was visceral, years of rejection and abandonment crystallizing into this one moment. That's not true. You know that's not what this is about. Then what is it about? She demanded. Tell me. Make me understand why I'm always the one who gets left behind. Bobby Kennedy, the man who'd faced down the most dangerous criminals in America without flinching, found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain that he was making the practical choice, the responsible choice, the choice that protected his family and his future? How could he make her understand that sometimes love, or whatever this was between them, wasn't enough? I have responsibilities, he finally said. My wife, my children, my position. I can't just throw all that away. But you can throw me away. Not a question, a statement, a fact. I'm not. He stopped, realizing anything he said would be inadequate. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they couldn't say, all the futures that would never happen. Finally, Marilyn spoke, her voice different now, quieter, resigned. I'm tired, Bobby. I'm so tired of being everyone's secret, everyone's shame, everyone's biggest mistake. Your brother used me and threw me away. Now you're doing the same thing. At least Jack never pretended it was anything more than it was. That's not fair, Bobby said, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. Fair? Marilyn laughed bitterly. Nothing about my life has ever been fair. Why should this be different? Wait a minute. Don't miss this detail. Because what happened in the hours after that phone call is where the story becomes either a tragedy or a conspiracy, depending on who you believe. The official story says Marilyn took too many pills, accidentally or intentionally, and died alone in her bedroom sometime in the early morning hours of August 5th. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, found her around 3 a.m. The police weren't called until 4:25 a.m. The cause of death was ruled probable suicide. Case closed. Except nothing about that night makes sense if you look closely. The timeline is wrong. The scene was too clean. There were no pills in her stomach during the autopsy, suggesting the drugs that killed her were administered another way. Her diary, which friends said contained details about the Kennedy brothers, disappeared. Phone records from her house that night were confiscated and never released, and multiple witnesses, including Peter Lawford and neighbors, reported seeing Bobby Kennedy at or near Marilyn's house that afternoon and evening. Some say he was there to retrieve compromising documents or recordings. Some say he was there to end things in person. Some say his presence was entirely innocent. And some say he was involved in her death, either directly or through intermediaries. The truth is, we'll probably never know for certain what happened that night. But here's what we do know. Marilyn Monroe died alone at 36 years old in a house she'd only recently purchased because she was so desperate to finally have a real home. She died after being used and discarded by the two most powerful men in America. She died while under surveillance by the FBI, who had a file on her that was over 300 pages long. She died after threatening, according to some accounts, to hold a press conference about her relationships with the Kennedy brothers. She died at a moment when she'd become a massive political liability to Camelot. Does that prove conspiracy? Number. Does it prove murder? Number. But it does prove that Marilyn Monroe's death was convenient for a lot of very powerful people. And in the days after her death, those powerful people did everything they could to control the narrative. Peter Lawford, who'd spent years facilitating the Kennedy brothers' affairs, suddenly couldn't remember much about his last conversation with Marilyn. Bobby Kennedy, who'd been in Los Angeles that weekend, had his whereabouts carefully accounted for by Kennedy loyalists. The FBI's investigation focused on potential communist connections rather than political ones. And the story that emerged of a troubled, depressed actress who took too many pills fit neatly into the narrative Hollywood and America wanted to believe. But the people who actually knew Marilyn tell a different story. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, said she'd been making plans for the future, talking about upcoming projects, showing signs of improvement. Her friend and masseur, Ralph Roberts, said she'd seemed scared in her final weeks, paranoid that her phone was tapped, worried about powerful people who wanted her silent. Her publicist, Pat Newcomb, who spent the night before Marilyn died at her house, gave confusing and contradictory statements to the police, then left the country for months. And Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, changed her story multiple times over the years, eventually admitting in the 1980s that she'd lied about the timeline and that Bobby Kennedy had indeed been at the house that day. You won't believe this, but here's where the story gets even darker. In the decades since Marilyn's death, multiple people connected to that night have died under suspicious circumstances or come forward with deathbed confessions. Peter Lawford, racked with guilt, told friends before his death that he knew more than he'd ever said publicly. A Los Angeles police intelligence officer claimed the department had recordings of Marilyn with the Kennedy brothers, recordings that were confiscated and disappeared. An ambulance driver came forward decades later, claiming he'd transported Marilyn to a hospital that night, alive, and that she died there, contradicting the official story that she was found dead in her bed. A private investigator hired by the district attorney to look into Marilyn's death had his files stolen in a break-in where nothing else was taken. Are all these people lying? Are they attention seekers capitalizing on a famous tragedy? Maybe. But it's also possible that the truth about Marilyn Monroe's death is more complicated, more sinister than the official story admits. It's possible that the Kennedy brothers, or people protecting the Kennedy brothers, were involved in silencing a woman who'd become too dangerous, too unpredictable, too willing to expose the truth about Camelot's darkest secrets. It's possible that Marilyn Monroe didn't commit suicide at all. And it's possible that we've been sold a lie for over 60 years because the alternative, that America's royal family was involved in the death of America's princess, is too terrible to accept. But let's step back from the conspiracy theories and focus on what we know for certain, on the human tragedy at the center of all this speculation and scandal. Marilyn Monroe was a deeply damaged woman who spent her entire life looking for love and finding only exploitation. She was passed from foster home to foster home as a child, learning early that affection was conditional and safety was temporary. She was sexually abused as a teenager, teaching her that her body was her only currency. She became a star by playing dumb and sexy, even though she was smart and complex. And she spent her final years desperately trying to be taken seriously, to be valued for something more than her appearance, to find someone who would love Norma Jean, not just desire Marilyn Monroe. The Kennedy brothers represented hope to her. JFK was the most powerful man in the world choosing her, validating her importance. Bobby was the intellectual who engaged with her mind, who saw her as a person. But in the end, they were just like all the other men who'd used her. Studio executives, directors, athletes, playwrights, politicians. They took what they wanted and left when she became inconvenient. And Marilyn, who'd never learned that she deserved better, accepted this pattern as inevitable, even as it destroyed her. The phone calls that summer tell the story. Marilyn calling Bobby's office, desperate to talk. Bobby's secretary making excuses, saying he was in meetings, saying he'd call back and he never did. Marilyn calling Peter Lawford, asking him to intervene to make Bobby understand how much she needed him. Peter, caught between his wife's family and his friend, making promises he couldn't keep. And finally, that last call on August 4th, Bobby delivering the message he should have delivered months earlier. It's over. Stay away from us. You're on your own now. The cruelty wasn't intentional, but it was crushing nonetheless. What people don't understand about Marilyn Monroe's death is that it wasn't really about the Kennedys. They were just the final straw, the last in a lifetime of abandonments. Marilyn's mother was institutionalized when she was 7. Her father was never in the picture. She bounced between 11 different foster homes before she was 16. She was married at 16 to escape the foster system. That marriage ended. Her second marriage to Joe DiMaggio ended because she chose her career over his traditional values. Her third marriage to Arthur Miller ended when she realized he was embarrassed by her public image and disappointed by her private reality. Every relationship in her life followed the same pattern: initial infatuation, growing attachment, eventual abandonment. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn was broken in ways that had nothing to do with the Kennedys and everything to do with a lifetime of trauma that had never been properly addressed or healed. She was mixing alcohol with barbiturates daily. She was seeing multiple psychiatrists, some of whom were prescribing conflicting medications. She was having trouble remembering her lines on set. She was increasingly paranoid, increasingly erratic, increasingly unable to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. The Kennedy affair didn't create these problems, but it certainly exacerbated them. It gave her hope that she could be more than Marilyn Monroe, that she could have a real relationship with a serious man, that she could escape the trap of her image and her past. And when that hope was taken away, it took away one of the last things keeping her going. The night she died, Marilyn made a series of phone calls. She called Peter Lawford around 7:30 p.m. Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to Jack, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy. The words were slurred, the implication clear. This was a suicide note delivered verbally. Peter, alarmed, tried to get someone to check on her, but the attempts were half-hearted, confused. By the time anyone actually went to her house, it was too late. She called her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, who came to her house around 5 p.m. and stayed for several hours. What they discussed has never been fully disclosed. She called Joe DiMaggio Jr., rambling about loneliness and regret. She may have called others, Bobby Kennedy himself, according to some accounts, though this has never been confirmed. And then, sometime in the early morning hours of August 5th, Marilyn Monroe died. Whether by accident, suicide, or something more sinister, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that the world lost a talented actress who never got to reach her full potential, a damaged woman who never found the healing she desperately needed, and a human being who spent her entire life looking for love in a world that only wanted to use her. The Kennedy brothers went on with their lives. JFK assassinated 15 months later. Bobby assassinated 6 years after that. Peter Lawford lived with guilt and alcoholism until his death in 1984, and Marilyn Monroe became frozen in time, forever 36, forever beautiful, forever the blonde bombshell who died tragically young. But the story doesn't quite end there. Because in death, Marilyn Monroe became even more famous than she was in life. The conspiracy theories kept her name in the headlines. The mystery around her death ensured she'd never be forgotten. And the connection to the Kennedys, whether romantic, political, or deadly, tied her forever to America's most mythologized family. She became a symbol, a cautionary tale, a mystery unsolved. And in becoming all those things, she once again became everything except what she wanted most to be. Just a woman, just Norma Jean, loved for who she really was rather than what she represented. What you've seen is nothing compared to the complexity of the truth. The Kennedy connection wasn't a simple scandal or a straightforward affair. It was a collision between power and vulnerability, between public image and private pain, between the most privileged men in America and one of the most damaged women. It was about loneliness on both sides, Marilyn's desperate need to be loved, Bobby's inability to reconcile his desire with his duty, and in the end, it was about the inevitable tragedy that occurs when people are valued for what they symbolize rather than who they are. Marilyn Monroe deserved better. She deserved therapy that actually helped rather than further complicated her life. She deserved friends who protected her rather than enabled her. She deserved lovers who valued her rather than used her. And she deserved a culture that saw her as a person rather than an object. But she didn't get any of those things. What she got was fame, exploitation, and ultimately a lonely death in a house that was supposed to represent her finally having a home. The Kennedy brothers got to be remembered as heroes, martyrs, symbols of a golden age in American politics. Marilyn Monroe got to be remembered as a tragic blonde, a cautionary tale about the price of fame, and the subject of endless speculation about who killed her and why. Neither legacy does justice to the actual people involved, the complicated, flawed human beings behind the myths. But that's what happens when private lives become public property, when relationships become scandals, when people become symbols. The truth gets lost in the narrative, and what remains is just another Hollywood story with a tragic ending. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe the Kennedy connection contributed to Marilyn's death? Was it suicide, accident, or something more sinister? Do powerful people deserve privacy even when their actions hurt others? Share your theories and thoughts in the comments. If this story made you think, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more deep dives into Hollywood's greatest mysteries, the dark side of fame, and the human stories behind the legends. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next investigation.